Miss Dagon. Right, when you're ready, Miss Trainer.
Thank you, my lord. I wonder if you can start by telling us your name.
Okay, hi, my name's Daljeet Dagon.
And you, I think, as per your statement, are a programme manager at Barnardo, Scotland, is that right?
I am, yeah.
You have provided a statement to the inquiry, and for our benefit and the benefit of the recording, that bears the reference SCIWT 0485, 5 zeros and then a 1. You should understand that all of that information will form part of the evidence that the inquiry is able to consider. Your statement, first of all, goes through your professional background and tells us, I think, that you began working at Barnardo some 26 years ago.
Yep, I did.
And you tell us, I think, that you've had various roles, but I wonder if you could maybe summarise the services that you were running in 2020.
Yep, so I'm managing a kind of two portfolio of services, one specifically in relation to child exploitation, which is both sexual and criminal exploitation, and that was primarily in the west of Scotland, but also in Dundee and Fife at the time, and also intensive family support services, which straddled two different local authorities, which was Glasgow City and Eastern Bartonshire.
So we've got family support services where do you support the whole family as opposed to individual children?
Yeah, so we have kind of two services. One is about trying to keep children at home where it's safe to do so, and if not, obviously look at alternative options. And it's very much about providing support to all the individual children as well as the parents and carers that kind of support that child, and also in terms of our parent capacity assessment service, that's about supporting children who've already been removed from the home, but it's very much about assessing the parents and carers' ability to have long-term care of those children. So it's about helping at the local authority make decisions in terms of permanence and long-term planning for those children.
At paragraph 17 of your statement, you describe the children that you work with, and you say essentially that they vary and the families vary, but in a sense they all come under the category of vulnerable. I wondered if you could explain that further.
Yeah, so basically it's quite funny because thinking back, our service was known as Last Chance Saloon. So like the families that we worked with were families had been through every other service possible, and it was about working with children who were primarily on the child protection register. That was, so if you can think about all the issues that go with that in terms of children being on the register due to physical neglect, physical injury, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, so that's primarily the kind of group of children that we worked with. And obviously in terms of our child exploitation services, we were working with children who were directly experiencing exploitation at the time.
In terms of where the referrals to your service come from, do those come directly from the local authority, from social work departments? Yeah,
so in terms of our family support services, because we were commissioned, they all came from local authority social workers. In terms of our exploitation services, because Barnardo's puts a lot of its own funding into that, we have referrals from local authority, police, education, health, but also sometimes from children and families themselves, and primarily families that we've worked with. I remember we've had referrals from parents that I used to work with when I was a practitioner, and they were children, and they've actually made referrals for their own children because they've been so worried and concerned.
First of all, turning to the family support service that you described, you, in your statement, tell us about various impacts that the pandemic had on that service. But the first thing you mention at paragraph 26 is that part of the service is based in a local authority building, and that posed its own logistical difficulties for you because that building immediately was closed.
Yep. So in terms of Eastern Bartonshire, our parent capacity assessment service had to go online straight away because we weren't allowed in the building, and it wasn't a COVID secure building, and none of the tenants were allowed in the building. And that was quite challenging because you already had parents who were struggling to engage with the service because of the very nature of it. So those processes in terms of making decisions that would affect children's long-term kind of well-being were delayed even longer because parents were enabled not to engage with the service, and then getting online wasn't easy because actually ourselves as an organisation, as a large children's charity, we didn't actually have the capacity because we weren't used to engaging with people, and then there were certain platforms that we couldn't use, we weren't allowed to use because they weren't secure. And then obviously, even if we could access platforms, our families didn't have devices, didn't have Wi-Fi. So it was about trying to organise and arrange all that. So that took a wee bit of time. So that group of staff actually supported our wider family support services so that they were still engaged. So that did take a bit of support, but we actually then took the service out to families' homes, and we tried to actually, because normally with our parent capacity assessment service, people would come into our place. We had it set up like a home. We had a kitchen, you had a bathroom, we had like a two-way mirror, so we weren't in the same room as families as they were trying to, I suppose, engage in normal family practices. So we were actually, where we could, go into families' homes, but we were also met with quite a lot of reticence in terms of, we've got COVID, or we don't want to let people in because we're scared about germs coming into the house. So, and there was no consequences for those families, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but that way, it's like, at the end of the day, we were trying to make decisions or help the local authority make long-term decisions for children, and we weren't being able to do that because families were allowed to kind of delay things. But in terms of our intensive family support service, we basically, we did doorstep visits. We did, if it was a case of shouting up to the window, that's what we did. The families didn't, because it was about trying to see children as much as possible. So even if it was getting a wave at the window or a conversation through the letterbox or at the door, and we made every effort to try and kind of see children. And also, there was lots of children who didn't have access to gardens, for instance. So in terms of our prioritisation, it was about thinking about which children weren't getting out at all, and which children were getting fresh air and exercise. So trying to work out, it was about trying to persuade families or children to go out for a walk or go for a cycle or whatever. So we kind of got, we tried everything we could, do you know what I mean, just to make sure that we were setting eyes and physical eyes on children and young people rather than online. And although it was good having the opportunity to go online, we tried to do it face-to-face as much as possible.
It's maybe tempting for us to assume that everyone during that time tried to move things online, but I think at paragraph 29 of your statement, you say you consciously tried not to do that.
Yep.
I wonder if you can maybe explain the reasons why you didn't think that was appropriate all the time.
Yeah, so obviously we're working with children and families where the kind of reason that they've been referred to our services is because there's a lot of often harm within the home as well as outside of the home. So we deliberately didn't do a lot of online stuff because we didn't know who else was in the room. There was no privacy, and what we didn't want was children being coached by others in terms of letting us know that everything was okay. So it was very much about wanting to see children physically, and also want to make sure that they were not being coerced into working with us or seeing us or saying certain things. It was very much about trying to get to see children and families and parents where there was, because we were actually working with families where there was domestic abuse, where there was sexual abuse and exploitation, so we just didn't know who else was actually around and whether what they were saying was like I said, whether they were being coerced or manipulated. So that's why we deliberately didn't try to do things online.
You also, later on in your statement, I think, touch on a matter you mentioned before, where sometimes families who are referred to your service maybe are families who typically don't really want to engage to start off with, and maybe COVID and the lockdown being quite a good excuse for that to happen. Can you tell me more about how you managed to reach those families?
Yeah. I think from our perspective, I suppose what we were was persistent, and we persevered, and even when families weren't letting us in, we kept going, and we would say, right, we're coming back tomorrow or Friday or next week, do you know what I mean? And we'd put notes through the door, we'd leave activity packs like word puzzles or fidget toys, anything we could think of, do you know what I mean? And I think certainly, I suppose one of the things I've always done as a practitioner is try to think about the practical things people need. And it's not about, coercing or manipulating families into into working with you, but it's about, you know, really simple things about actually what is it that this family needs, because there'll be a whole raft of reasons why families have been referred to our services, but people often don't think about, well, how are they going to get from A to B? Do you know what I mean? What's going to assist them? So it was things like doing food parcels and recognising that although children weren't able to go to school, it wasn't just school education they missed out on, it was a breakfast, it was a lunch, and a lot of families couldn't afford that. So it's simple things like organising cereal, organising milk, and it sounds really basic, but for a lot of these families, they didn't have that. So we got into a routine where every week we made sure we were buying breakfast material, stuff and lunch stuff specifically for families. We were doing word puzzles, like I said, colouring books, fidget toys, getting things like chocolate, making sure that they were remembering people's birthdays. If it was like a kind of celebration, whether it was Christmas or Diwali or Eid or whatever, we were making sure that we were making a fuss of people and just keeping people in mind all the time. So whether that door was opened or not, we were persevering, shouting up the window, like I said. People always chapped the door, and we would try different workers as well, because obviously a lot of the families that we work with, we would have more than one worker, so we just persevered all the time, tried what we could.
In your statement at paragraph 32, you really go on to talk about the observations that you think the pandemic the impact the pandemic had on children and young people accessing the service. And the first thing you say is that it caused stress and tension, which was above normal levels, and that was something that you were seeing. How were you seeing that?
So we often work with families where there's large sibling groups, and I suppose in terms of like referrals, for instance, I suppose you asked me right at the beginning, do you work with the whole family or do you work with individual children? Often what we would find is when a referral is made to our service, it'll be the child that sticks out for the family or the local authority. So often people pay a lot of attention to that particular child, and what we've always done is said, like, actually what we're going to do is work with the whole family, work with all the children, but you will always still have an emphasis on one or two, so that can cause additional stress and tension. But you've also got children who've got multiple support needs, so we had children with neurodiversity, and sometimes children would be going to different schools and obviously accessing different levels of support, and weren't used to being with each other 24/7. You also had families where parents might have been working from home, or they only had one parent in the home. So often what you'd have is there'd be shared care arrangements, and initially what you'd have was everybody in the one home, and there was no respite either for the mum or the dad who was the main carer, or for the other brothers and sisters. So there was a lot of competitiveness, but also there was a lot of harm as well, and I'm sure you'll probably ask me about this later on, but some of that harm also led to sibling sexual abuse as well, because children were cooped up. They were in environments that they weren't used to being together 24/7, and there was a lack of supervision and guidance. And also in terms of education, although children had access to education, they found it repetitive, and it didn't motivate them. It wasn't interesting, and also children have very different learning styles, and not all the children that we were working with were able to engage with that type of learning either. You also had parents and carers who had very poor or no literacy skills and numeracy skills, so they didn't have the ability to support their child. So actually, because there was no respite in terms of, and if children didn't have a garden, they were stuck in a multi-storey building and they couldn't get out, and there was nobody to take them out. We often had parents who were suffering from mental health issues or addiction issues or had mobility issues, so they weren't taking children out either. So for us, they became our priorities in terms of who we invested in terms of, right, okay, we need to get you out, we need to see you, we need to bring you to our office, in terms of, and sometimes it was about actually different workers taking different children out and doing different things so that they were separated, because which was the opposite of what we'd done in the past, because in the past it was about trying to work with children so that they were I suppose, adopting skills around negotiation, around compromise, around, you know, looking at their socialisation. Whereas this time round it was about that separation, because it was about giving children that opportunity to just talk about their own individual stresses and worries without necessarily worrying their younger brothers and sisters. Do you know what I mean? Or it was about, they're doing my head in and I want time away from them. So it was about thinking about what would be in their best interests and trying to be able to support that as much as possible.
As well as the stress and the tension and maybe a difficult environment at home, you also talk about your experience of seeing more young people presenting with sexually transmitted infections. Yeah. And you say that's due to more children being unsupervised and having sexual contact. Is that something that the service experienced anecdotally from staff feeding that back?
Yeah, so we had that direct information from children and young people, but we also had feedback from the local authority and also health workers who were seeing a rise in infections such as gonorrhea, for instance, that hadn't existed for a long time. And they were also had young people who were unknown to them presenting with talking about unprotected sex because they didn't have access to contraception, but also children being coerced and manipulated into having sex when they didn't want to have sex. And I suppose, you know, just in terms of, just earlier on we spoke about mental health and stress and tension, and I suppose it was about children trying to offer each other comfort and support, but that becoming exploitative and abusive as well. So that was direct information that we had from children and young people, but like I said, also from colleagues in health and social work. And that was particularly noticeable in one particular local authority, and we had conversations, and also in terms of some of starting to look at registrations and some of the reasons, and some of the reasons for children starting to come to their attention to services that they hadn't previously been known to.
When you say registrations, do you mean
child protection registrations?
Child protection
yeah.
registrations.
So I'm talking about under 16-year-olds. I'm not talking about children over the age of 16 here.
Another thing you mentioned again, anecdotally, is that you saw what you perceived to be an increase in the use of alcohol amongst young people.
Yep. So certainly, I mean, obviously, in terms of the work that we've done for years and years around exploitation, alcohol and exploitation pretty much go hand in hand. In terms of, you know, children being coerced into taking alcohol and drugs as a way of, you know, I suppose manipulating them and into engaging in activities that they wouldn't ordinarily engage in. And certainly what children were saying to us was access to alcohol was very easy because there was more alcohol in homes. Because families were doing a lot more online shopping, so rather than buying one bottle of wine, they might buy 3 bottles of wine or whatever, do you know what I mean? So because it was about bulk buying, and I suppose everybody, myself included, got involved in bulk buying, whether it was toilet rolls or whatever it was that people were buying. So because there was increased alcohol in the home, families weren't really missing. If something went missing, do you know what I mean? If it was a bottle of vodka or a bottle of wine or whatever, it wasn't as noticeable as it would have been in the past. So there was access to alcohol, but also young people were reporting that their own parents were drinking more, but also drinking longer in the day because they were working from home. So rather than like getting up at, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning to get dressed, showered, out the house, you were maybe rolling out your bed at 8, half 8, you know, sticking on a hoodie or a smart top and sitting in front of a screen. So, and you weren't like driving to work or whatever, so people didn't have those same restrictions, but there was a lot more alcohol in the home, and that's certainly what children had reported to us, as well as having access to alcohol as well. And I think just going back to what I said earlier on about children having more likely to be coerced into having sex, that was also as a result of having consumed alcohol as well.
At paragraph 34, you say there was an assumption that children and young people were breaching lockdown rules all the time by going out. But you were being told the opposite, as some of the children and young people you worked with said that it was beneficial for them to stay in their house because that would avoid them being exposed to external harms. What type of harms are you discussing there?
So we had numerous examples of young people, and young women in particular, less so boys, but certainly young women in particular, who were kind of proudly saying to us, you know, it's been brilliant being at home, because it means I've got an excuse. I can say to so and so that I can't get out, I can't see you, because I'm not allowed, because Nicola Sturgeon has said we've got to be at home, we can't stay, we can't go out, and for a lot of young people, it was a relief, because previously when they'd been out and about, they would be, as I said, be manipulated into engaging in activities that they didn't want to engage in, and by that I'm talking about rape and sexual assault, and that's what was happening to our children and young people on a daily basis prior to COVID, because they weren't in control of what was happening and what was going on, whereas actually this was one way that they could take back control and say, actually, I need to be home, I can't get out, I'm not allowed out, because before, what a lot of people don't understand about exploitation and grooming in particular is that it's not only the child that gets groomed, often families are groomed as well, and parents and carers. So actually, you know, offenders are very skilled in terms of the tactics that they use. So actually, this way, you know, children and families were able to say, no, you know, so and so has to stay at home and they're not allowed out, which was for a lot of children, you know, one, beneficial, but also a sense of relief in terms of, actually, I'm not going to be forced into doing something I don't want to do, because actually I've got a really good reason to stay at home.
You go on, I think, to caveat that by saying the unfortunate thing is offenders are always able to adapt to unusual circumstances. What ways did you see that manifest?
Yeah, so very specifically, young people spoke to us about how offenders were saying to them, but you're allowed out for an hour's exercise every day, so you can get out. So see that hour's exercise that you're getting out for, that's when you come and meet me. And also parents and carers, where obviously they were keen for their child to get out and get exercise, get fresh air, so they were also kind of pushing the child to get out for that hour's exercise as well. And unfortunately, for a lot of children, they felt exposed. And if you remember, in the early days of COVID, or maybe it's just me looking at it through rose-tinted glasses, but the weather seemed much better, and it seemed warmer, and everyone was out and about, and you had a spring in your step, and people were going to parks and in these kind of public environments, and that basically, that's where a lot of offenders were kind of coercing children into meeting them, and sex would take place and harms would take place, whether that child wanted to or not. So it was very specifically around that hour's exercise time where children felt, I suppose, that they were coerced into being harmed. But also, I think, certainly, when I think back, there was some children who had spoke about domestic abuse and tension in the home and lots of family arguments, so they would kind of sneak out the window, do you know what I mean? And obviously, we were all encouraged to provide devices for children, so access to social media, you know, increased exponentially. You know, so people would actually make contact with anyone that they saw as being able to kind of support them in their hour of need. So there was times both during the day and also covertly that children got out and were exposed to harm.
The types of harm that you describe and that you talk about in terms of exploitation and sexual abuse, you talk about those in your statement really kind of anecdotally and in generality. Do you know if statistics exist in relation to that?
Not as far as I'm aware, I don't think so. And I think one of the challenges was we weren't routinely having those multi-agency meetings that you would have where information would be shared across agencies, so we weren't able to kind of join the dots in terms of this is the information that we've got, this is the information that police has got, in the way that we map all the time, both pre-COVID and post-COVID. That just simply didn't happen. And it was interesting because when I was thinking back, and I was chatting to staff yesterday, and we actually, it's funny how you kind of forget things, and you shouldn't forget things, but actually we very vividly remember a young woman that we worked with who was age 16 at the time, and she'd been raped, and she wasn't able to tell anybody. She wasn't able to give a statement because she felt she wasn't able to leave the house. She believed that all police stations were shut, so she couldn't go into a police station even during that hour's exercise. So when you think back, you think, how horrific was that? Do you know what I mean? That a child, and it's hard enough for somebody who's been exposed to harm like that to actually tell, but even when you want to tell, thinking actually there's no one to tell because there's nowhere or no place I can go to tell. So I think for that, I suppose when you think back, you think it maybe wasn't the right thing to do in terms of saying to people you can't go out or all these places need to be shut. But there's simply, in terms of statistics, there was nobody who was recording. And like, even in hindsight, you know, we would normally record themes and trends and patterns and, you know, unmet need. But because we were having to, you know, kind of respond to so many different returns for local authorities and also our own organisation and the Care Inspectorate, plus we were also having to risk assess, and those risk assessments would change every 3 weeks, and we were told by Scottish Government about what we could do, what we couldn't do, and what was increasing. We didn't actually routinely record some of those anecdotes or to see whether there was trends or patterns, and in hindsight that's probably not the right thing to have done, but we were all living in the here and now, do you know what I mean, and just focusing with what was happening right now and what could be happening next week in a fortnight. So we just didn't, and there was nobody who was kind of I suppose cross correlating that information with other organisations in the way that we did before and continue to do now.
So you're now at a stage, I suppose, when you're able to discuss matters with staff and able to reflect and maybe identify some of the themes that at the time were kind of overtaken by a lot of what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Because it was just like, because there was so much reporting to be done, and there was so much about, like, you know, whether you could go into somebody's house, how many people could be there, you know, just all those different things about where you could go, where you couldn't go. And I suppose that energy was just on all of that, and from my perspective, my energy was also around supporting our staff team, and we had two staff teams. You had one that was working and you had one that was shielding, and it was about trying to make sure that everybody's needs were being met, and it was about trying to make sure that those staff who were shielding still felt part of a team, still felt part of a service, and they tried to support the colleagues who were working as much as possible from their homes by doing simple things like, so say for instance we were putting nurture bags together or getting fidget toys, whatever. It was them that were like on Amazon, you know, identifying what to buy, getting things delivered, all that kind of stuff, do you know what I mean? So for me, it was very much about meeting the needs of our staff team, and especially those who are living on their own, in particular, because the first thing I did was find out who was living on their own, and I had them in the office as quickly as possible, so I was seeing them, and making sure that they were, you know, I suppose in terms of their emotional well-being, and it sounds really daft, but every Wednesday, for instance, we used to, as a staff team, that was our day when we had I play hockey, and through my hockey club we organised food being delivered to our office, so that we could then put together food parcels for all the families. So we had a group of staff who'd pull all that together. Then we had another group of staff who'd then pick that up and deliver it. And funnily enough, because my boyfriend, he would make a pot of soup every week, and every week I would take that pot of soup into work on a Wednesday. So every week, once people had packed all the stuff, we'd all have a bowl of soup together. Do you know what I mean? And it was just simple things like that made such a difference in terms of, you know, supporting people, keeping an eye on people, but also that camaraderie in terms of working together and supporting families, and particularly, and people that, and yes, people were getting support from government in terms of, you know, like additional food vouchers to schools and stuff, but I don't think people appreciated what it's like having children. Well, I'm not a parent, but having children in the house 24/7, because children need fed. It's not just about breakfast, lunch and dinner, it's all the snacks, and it's children just constantly eat if they can't get out, do you know what I mean? So it was just making sure that, you know, things were topped up and things were, families were supported. So yeah, it was full on.
You go on in paragraph 36 to talk about how perhaps safeguarding concerns weren't able to be picked up, and you say protective environments such as school just simply didn't exist. And so there were less people to set eyes on children and for them to talk to and maybe report concerns. Does that mean, from your perspective, that the organisation saw an increase in your own safeguarding concerns coming to light because nobody else really had eyes on these children?
Yeah, definitely. But I think one of the biggest challenges for us was where to take it. Because in the past, I mean, working for the voluntary sector, sometimes, I mean, like, power dynamics always play a part when it comes to multi-agency meetings. And often when you would, well, when I've been in meetings and my staff are going in meetings in the past, often you would seek support from other agencies in terms of, yes, I've seen that change in behaviour, yes, you know, I've also seen that change in appearance or whatever. But because we were the only agency that was actually seeing children and young people, it became harder to amplify the voices of children, but also amplify our own voice, so that other organisations were hearing what we were saying and recognising the concerns and thinking about whether we needed to escalate. Also, there was a reluctance to challenge those families where parents were reluctant in terms of letting you in the home. It was a case of, yeah, I can understand because they've got underlying health conditions, or they've had COVID, or they've had COVID 3 times. I can understand why they don't want to let anyone in. Whereas in the past, it would have been, no, the reason we've got the pay service involved is because actually we're concerned about the vulnerability of these children, and if you don't let, you know, PACE in, then we'll look at a joint visit with social work, or we'll look at X, Y and Z. None of that was happening, and we were kind of left on our own to not just persevere, but also raise those concerns and keep on raising them, but not have that same ability in terms of influencing decisions, because we didn't have the same support from school in particular, and also from children's perspective. A lot of children, you know, for going to school isn't just about education, it's about seeing their pals, it's about seeing their favourite teacher, it's about being able to get a bit of respite from what's going on at home, do you know what I mean, in terms of feeling unsafe or feeling overwhelmed. So we just didn't have that ability to actually engage, and also trying to get hold of workers was really difficult, because a lot of social workers in particular were working from home, but they hadn't been provided with work phones, for instance. So it was quite difficult, and they didn't have laptops, so it was quite hard trying to make contact with them. So yeah, it wasn't easy. Certainly in the first kind of 3 to 6 months, it was quite hard.
You talk at paragraph 45 about new referrals to your service, and you say that that's one area which you think didn't work well.
No.
Did you continue to get new referrals
Yes.
throughout the time of the pandemic?
Yeah, all the time. So we got new referrals in terms of exploitation work as well as intensive family support work. And the difficulty we had was we had no relationship with those families at all, because ordinarily what we would have done is, so when we get a referral, we would always have a joint visit with a social worker, and we would kind of explain to the family about why we were involved, what people's worries and concerns were, and what our intentions were, and it was very much a kind of collaborative approach. So straight off there was no joint visits because social work weren't working in the same way that we were, so we were having to cold call, and obviously cold call, because it was a family that we didn't know, we'd always have 2 workers. Do you know what I mean? So straight away people's backs were up, people didn't know who we were, it hadn't been explained to them about why they'd been referred to our service. There was a lot of mistrust, so families weren't letting us in. So, and we kept persevering, but one of the things that we found was families just didn't want us to have access to their children unsupervised. They were reluctant for us to have their children on their own, and a lot of that's because a lot of the families that we've traditionally worked with don't trust agencies or don't trust adults. And we didn't have that ability to get alongside parents and work with them, because in the past what we would have done is children would have been at school, so we would have met parents on their own. We would have either been in the home, or we would have invited them to the office, or we would have taken them for a coffee, or whatever kind of best suited their needs. But because children were in the house, there was no privacy, there was no ability to have conversations about what that parent was required to do in terms of being able to have the capacity or the ability to safeguard their children. So we just weren't able to get alongside, and sometimes, unfortunately, we had to say to social workers, we actually can't engage this family, we can't work with this family, we haven't been able to see the child. And that happened with some of our exploitation cases where those children hadn't been known to us prior to the pandemic. So sometimes, unfortunately, we had children who were left in harmful situations, both in the home but also out with the home, because we simply weren't able, and like we tried whatever we could, and you name it, we tried it, but sometimes we had to just say, we can't do this, but we would always make sure that we were communicating with all the relevant organisations and looking at alternative means, because if there was, for instance, somebody else that child had a better relationship with, whether it had been a teacher or whether it had been a social worker or a youth worker, we would try to engage them to see if we could, through them, try to engage that young person. So the difficulty for us was that other organisations weren't as agile as we tried to make ourselves. So there was a kind of reluctance to try and get alongside us to try and support those young people, unfortunately.
I think in particular one of the elements that you say maybe wasn't agile or wasn't as thought through was that there existed these education hubs. Sorry, this is at paragraph 50 of your statement. There existed these education hubs specifically for vulnerable young people, and some people did access them, but you say the vast majority in your experience didn't, but also education departments wouldn't engage with you to let you go into schools and also help.
Yeah. So in terms of some of the children that we've worked with, it was clear pre-pandemic that a lot of the young people actually needed support to be in school and to stay in school. Some of the children that we worked with wouldn't get past the first bell. So you're talking, they weren't able to stay in school beyond 10:30, which might seem bizarre for a lot of people, but for a lot of children that we worked with, that was their daily life. So some of the work that we did pre-pandemic was being with them during playtime, to kind of support those social interactions, to support them into that class after lunch, to maybe stay with them in that class, or to do something different, so that they were still in the school environment, but they weren't necessarily in the classroom. And when the hubs were set up, they were quite specific. So it was a case of there was school staff deployed and there were children, and no other agencies were allowed in. So those children that we would have supported to engage and interact with other children, or simply to be able to have the confidence to stay within the school environment, wasn't supported. Also, a lot of children go to school not just to be educated, but to see their pals. And when they were going to these education hubs, you'll know yourself, you'll remember that those hubs weren't for every child. Children were selected depending on vulnerabilities. So a lot of times when they went to school, their friends weren't there. So it was like that, it's no point in me going, because my best pal's not there, so I'm not going. So children just didn't go, and they weren't supported. Sometimes it was a case of, again, like I said, we worked with larger groups of sibling groups. So some children were going to school, to the education hubs, and some weren't. So again, that became quite divisive in families. And I don't think people were thinking through actually the impact that would have on families where some children could go to school and some couldn't. So it was difficult for parents to actually get them to school, because in terms of being able to leave children unsupervised at home whilst taking other children to school. So it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen at all.
You also go on to say at paragraph 52 that from your experience there was little attempt made to get children to engage in online education. And I wondered what you think was lacking and what could have been done better in order to get them to engage.
I don't think people understood the fact that, as we all do, children have different learning styles in terms of how they take in information, how they process information. Lots of the children that we worked with had one device between 5. Do you know what I mean? So they couldn't actually access education individually. And I know, and that was a challenge for everybody. It wasn't, so I'm not having a go at education or anything like that, but also children, if you think about our intensive family support services, some of the reasons that we got involved was because there was no structure in the family home, there was no routines, there was no boundaries. So when I'm talking about that, there was no kind of strict bedtime routines. There was no one supporting with homework. There was no one making sure that you got up in time to be able to go to school. Do you know what I mean? So children were on a routinely weren't prepared and weren't engaged and ready to engage in education. So it wasn't simply, it wasn't a simple thing like, okay, we'll give you a laptop or we'll give you an iPad and you can just switch it on and access Glow and here we go. Do you know what I mean? There was a lack of understanding about all the processes that come before you can actually switch that laptop on, in terms of, are you ready emotionally and physically, and actually what's your attention span like to be able to engage. And actually what children were saying to us was the information that they got was boring, it was repetitive, it was the same stuff, and it was of no interest to them, and they just stopped engaging.
You talk about a particular category of the young people you supported being very difficult for, and those are the children that were transitioning between primary and secondary school. And you felt, I think, like you weren't able to support them adequately into that transition. Again, I wondered what you think could have been done better in relation to that particular group of young people.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me one of the challenges was that we saw children as a homogenous group, and actually, in terms of the children that we worked on, young people we worked with, actually they had a whole range of needs, both emotional, behavioural, practical needs, and I always remember like working with a child who she had a really good experience in primary school, and when she got to secondary school she stopped going, and it wasn't until our staff got involved that we understood why she stopped going. And the reason she stopped going was she couldn't tell the time, right? And because she couldn't tell the time, she didn't know what time she had to be from one class to another class, right? Now, so if you think about primary school, you're in one class, you've got one teacher, you've got one set of classmates, feels quite secure, feels quite stable, and you've got children who then going into a high school environment. So children didn't have that support to prepare in terms of what it's like to go to a school where it's bigger, it's larger. You've got to navigate from one school, from one class to another class. It could be the other end of the building. How do I get there? How am I going to get there? Who's going to support me? So in terms of the work that we do, that's some of the things that we would do with the families that we would work with. We would support them to get to school. Sometimes we'd hang around until, like I said, till the playtime bell, and then help support them navigate to the next class. And to the do you know what I mean? That wasn't happening, and so suddenly children missed a whole year of education, and then they were expected to know their way around the school. They were expected to understand how to get to different classes. And be able to form relationships and behave, and by behave I mean like be able to stay silent almost for like 35 minutes in terms of that specific class, when they weren't used to doing that, because actually at home they'd go and get a glass of water, they'd go to the toilet, and you know yourself, I mean like if there's something else that you can do rather than focus on what you're supposed to, you'll go away and do it. So they weren't used to sitting in one place for like even 35 minutes for us, which seems, I mean, it's probably been 35 minutes or longer that I've been sitting here and I can do it. But if you've not been used to that and suddenly that's out with your comfort zone, it becomes quite difficult. And I suppose also the other thing when I was reflecting, some of our older young people, you know, is that transition from secondary school to adulthood has been quite difficult because they've missed out on work experience. Do you know what I mean? And careers advice and careers guidance. So they left school without having any support. I mean, I'm thinking like when I left school, I had, you know, did I really know what I wanted to do? Yes, I did, but that's because I was supported. Do you know what I mean? A lot of our young people left school and it's like that. It came to an end and they got no support ongoing. There was one of our staff yesterday was talking about just her younger brother, how he's starting his apprenticeship. He's aged 20 and he's just starting his apprenticeship now because he's missed out, and he's really struggling with engaging with his peers and that whole adult environment where he has to make decisions for himself rather than being guided and supported. So I think those two groups of young people, I think, have had very difficult experiences. And the other thing that we've really noticed is in terms of people who experience university, particularly in terms of social work students, we would routinely take social work students, and we've had social work students who spent their course online. So when we expected them to have their placements with us and have the work face to face, it was a massive shock for them. It was like, oh no, but I thought I could do my placement online. And you're thinking, no, you need to be in front of a child, you need to be in front of a family, you can't do that from being online. But that was their experience because for them, their placements had been online. Do you know what I mean? Very few universities had insisted on face-to-face placements. So I think there's been multiple challenges in terms of education and training.
I think in particular, you mentioned that aspect of there being an expectation to not maybe do practical work as much as a problem in recruiting your own staff.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's been really challenging because, like, I don't think we've had a single interview where people don't ask how much time they can spend working from home. And that's been a real challenge because actually you can't do the work that we do. I mean, yeah, online has some huge benefits. However, in terms of working with children and families and engagement, it's got to be face-to-face every single time. But even in terms of working with your peers and other practitioners, I mean, like, for me, a lot of online working works really well because I already had relationships with those practitioners, those managers, do you know what I mean? But trying to build a kind of relationship with somebody you don't know, because because when you have an online meeting, you log on and you have that meeting and it's done. There's none of that chit-chat before the meeting, during the meeting, you know, over a cup of tea afterwards, none of that. So in terms of recruitment, it's been challenging because, and also the other thing I found is, and if you think about that hours exercise, a lot of people got dogs, for instance, and particularly those people living on their own. And they've now got dogs, and those dogs need tended to and supported. So people have got other pressures on them in terms of priorities. So folk are like that, oh, but I need to be at home because, or I need to do the pick up and drop off from school. And you just can't. It's really difficult in terms of what people's expectations are of work, because we need to be able to see children. We need to see them, you know, after school hours, during school hours, in the evening, at the weekend. That's how we work. And that's the support that our commissioners expect. So it's been really challenging in terms of workers' expectations of what they can do.
Can I ask you, are you managing to break down? I mean, I understand exactly how it's come to pass, and perhaps I've got some sympathy for the people that ask these questions if they've never had to meet people face to face and so forth. But when you explain to us, I'm sure you do in an interview, that it is necessary for social workers to meet people face to face. Do they accept that, or are you actually finding this an obstacle that prevents you recruiting the number of people you want?
It's an interesting question, and my organisation probably won't thank me for this, but you know, that way we try to be too flexible with people, try to be too kind, rather than saying, actually, this is your job and this is what we need you to do. So I found myself as a manager saying, this is my expectations and this is what I expect you to do. I expect 80% of your time to be out there. Do you know what I mean? Because actually, pre-pandemic, 80% of people's work was expected to be in front of families or in meetings and stuff. So you always have 20% in terms of admin tasks.
Yeah,
do you know what I mean? So for instance, we continued to have our team meetings online. And that was okay, and that still feels okay because we see each other quite a lot. So like for instance, we recently took on a social work student last year, and we insisted that she had to be in the office and she had to be in and around her colleagues because her learning was very much about actually observing a colleague, maybe on a phone call to a social worker or shadowing home visits or whatever. And we said, we want you to do that for the first 4 weeks. And some of that was about trust as well, because we don't know these people. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And then it was about actually saying, we do trust you to go home and do your recordings. Do you know what I mean? We do, but we were saying for the first 4 weeks, we want you in here 100% of the time. But we do have this kind of 80-20 split, and that's our expectations. And as a manager, I have had some people say, oh, but so-and-so down the road isn't doing that, and they're allowed, and I'm like, in here, this are expectations, we're commissioned to do this, and actually this is, if we want to build relationships with children and families, this is how we build relationships, and there's no flexibility in that, do you know what I mean? And obviously, I am flexible and adaptable, do you know what I mean? But at the same time, I'm dead clear with what the expectations are.
And do people accept that, or do some of them simply refuse to take the work, the job?
We have challenges. We have people who will push boundaries, absolutely, and that's managed through supervision and team meeting structures. And I've never had to escalate that to a senior manager, because actually, eventually, people see what their colleagues are doing, and do you know what I mean? And also understand the benefits. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, you have people who will. Like I said, push boundaries. Some people have left, and there's no denial. Some people have left because they're not able to manage our expectations, and that's unfortunate. But for me, it's what I'd rather have is somebody with less experience, but actually somebody who's willing to learn and somebody who's prepared to do the work that's required, rather than somebody who thinks they can do it from home.
Thank you. Yeah. Ms. Trina.
I think you say at paragraph 65 of your statement, you did lose some staff, and the problem that you found is that none of them have been replaced like for like. So it's been difficult to find people who have the same skill set who have left.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about the number of people that were shielding, for instance, a lot of those people, I'm saying a lot, some of the staff that I had that were shielding didn't really recover, really struggled to come into work. Were dead fearful, were really scared, spent far too much time watching those newsreels again over and over and getting really worried. And some of those staff have gone on to jobs where they can have a better work-life balance, they can spend more time working from home, for instance. And they were very experienced staff, very committed staff pre-pandemic. I'm not saying that they weren't committed during the pandemic, do you know what I mean? But they had a different experience. And what I found is, and to be honest, pre-pandemic recruitment was hard, but it's even harder now because lots of people have made different choices in their life in terms of what they want, in terms of how much contact they want to have with people who are vulnerable, but also in terms of funding. We didn't have a cost of living rise, and even when we did, we offered our staff 1%. We had a one-off payment for staff, which was tax, so it wasn't actually what people were anticipating. And if you compare that to the public sector, rises of 9%, 10%, in real life, if you think about cost of living, it's huge in terms of the challenges. I've got staff who go to food banks. Do you know what I mean? It's not our family. It's not about our families going to food banks. Our staff are going to food banks, and these are qualified social workers who've chosen to work in the voluntary sector. But we cannot match the pay of the public sector, and we're not getting the cost of living rises that people had in the past. So in terms of recruitment, it's become quite challenging in terms of what people's expectations are. And obviously when you advertise a post, you advertise a full scale, people have expectations. I mean, like, just to kind of explain, during this whole process, some of our services have been retendered, and when you put in a tender, the local authority expects you to submit salaries that are mid-scale, midpoint. Now, we've got staff who are already at the top of their scale. So already, when we are going for tenders, we are already taking a hit because we know the local authority are not going to pay us what we're currently paying our staff, because we're only allowed to put in midpoint scales in the actual tender. So that becomes quite hard for an organisation to manage. If you think about the size of an organisation, and also as an organisation, we also lost quite a lot of funding. If you think about, we get quite a lot of revenue from our shops. Our shops were closed during the pandemic, so we lost a lot of revenue as well. So that's had a massive impact in terms of in terms of the level of voluntary funds that we have, and therefore we have had to prioritise where we spend our voluntary funds.
You also, I think, within your statement, talk about there being a distinction for some of your staff as being key workers and then some of them not, and that having a financial implication.
Yeah, that was horrendous. So one of my services is registered with Care Inspectorate, and one of the advantages of that actually was we get access to PPE, and we get access to PPE very early, and we also got access to vaccinations, which was fantastic. And we had this routine, where we, phoned in for a PPE order, picked it up. It was worked like clockwork. But one of the disadvantages was that the only workers that were recognised officially by Scottish Government as being key workers were those that were registered with Care Inspectorate and local authority workers. And bearing in mind the local authority workers, a lot of them work from home, whereas my staff didn't. So a small group of my staff were given a £500 bonus for being key workers and for doing the work that they did. That included my manager, incidentally. Do you know what I mean? And I had a whole heap of staff whose services aren't registered with Care Inspectorate, who got nothing. And my manager at the time, to be fair, tried to find a way of being able to give his £500 to, being able to, because like me, myself, I didn't want the £500. I wanted staff who were doing that frontline work, but who weren't working in a service that was registered, but there was no physical way of doing that. And we weren't actually allowed to do that, but there was this discrepancy in terms of, and it felt means tested, for want of a better phrase, in terms of who got and who didn't get. And actually a lot of workers who got that money weren't frontline workers, actually, in terms of actually what they were doing. But something like 2/3 of my staff didn't get that. And £500 doesn't seem like a lot of money, and for the staff it wasn't about money, it was about being valued. Do you know what I mean? And actually being respected in terms of what they were doing, and actually the danger that they faced, because at that time we didn't know what was going on, but they were still prepared to take some of those risks, and it just wasn't recognised, which was, I think it was a real shame and a really poor decision, actually.
You talk a bit about local authorities and social workers who are employed by local authorities and your contact with them. At paragraph 77, you say you were able to communicate with local authorities, but you never saw them. And you go on to explain that things like child protection conferences, children's hearings, things which were traditionally very important meetings in person, completely changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you think that had an impact on the people that you were serving?
I think we forgot about why we were there in the first place. And if you think about children's hearings in particular, it's a child's meeting, and it's a child that's, and we say this all the time, children are at the centre, that the child is at the core, it's their meeting, they determine who's at the meeting, and they can also have that, they've also got the ability to speak to panel members, for instance, on their own. Children's hearings just didn't happen. They just did not happen. And some of that was about not having the technology. Some of that, I think, was about the fact that schools were closed and people weren't working in the same way. So statutory workers weren't seeing workers, so there was delays in children's hearings because there was no ability, well, there was less ability for those workers to compile reports and to be able to share assessments. So actually children simply weren't seen, and their needs weren't recognised. It was a real struggle to try and get children's hearings, and even when they did start, for children to be present, there was no recognition about how we got children there. There was no recognition, like again, because there was no schools weren't open. It was quite difficult for parents to leave some children at home and bring other children. So it just didn't happen from a very practical perspective. They didn't have somebody to look after like a baby, so they couldn't bring the baby along. There was, because we were quite strict about how many people could be in the room. I myself have been in children's hearings where there's like 2 rows. There's that many people, in the hearing, but the numbers were restricted, and there was no recognition about who the child wanted in the room. There was other adults who were making some of those decisions. We were having child protection case conferences on the telephone. That was before things went online. And even when things went online, people would have their cameras off. That was both professionals and family members. Now, I think all of us have had technical issues, but sometimes that felt quite deliberate in terms of not being on screen. It felt, and particularly when you're on the phone or you were online, you didn't know who else was in the room. I remember myself going to a child protection case conference, which wasn't unusual actually pre-pandemic, where I hadn't met the child, I hadn't met the family, because sometimes when we had referrals, we might use that environment as our referral meeting. So it was more a information gathering setting rather than meeting the family and speaking about their issues. It was more about information gathering. But I remember it was a particular case. It was a child. She was 16. She was pregnant. She'd been the victim of sexual exploitation. She'd been raped, and her pregnancy was as a result of that rape. So quite a difficult experience. She herself had addiction issues. She was living at home, and although home was a safe environment, or safer environment, her mum, although supportive, had an abusive ex-partner. So this child had been exposed to domestic abuse. So there I was on the phone with a child and her mum who I'd never met, with no awareness of who else was in that home, where that violent ex-partner was in the home, trying to have very difficult conversations about her vulnerability and about how she was going to keep her child safe, and how she was going to take responsibility for keeping this child away from the offender, who was also the father of the child and had parental rights. So quite a difficult experience. And also I was very wary about not asking inappropriate questions, and that way in a meeting before, if you're in a face-to-face meeting, you could kick somebody under the table, or you could scowl at them in terms of saying don't be silly asking that. We couldn't do any of that. Do you know what I mean? So I found that whole experience very uncomfortable, because I found people in the meeting asking questions I didn't think that were appropriate, because we had no way of knowing who was in the room, but also we weren't able to see that person's reaction. Whether, because that way sometimes you think this person's very uncomfortable with what you've just asked, so to stop or to take a break. Let's give the person 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We weren't able to do that, and we weren't actually doing that. We weren't thinking about let's take a break. Do you know what I mean? And actually, I think one of our biggest failures is that we continue to have some of those meetings online, because I've heard colleagues in the statutory sector say they're efficient, they're effective, but they're efficient and effective for them. They're not efficient and effective for the child or for the family. Do you know what I mean? Because we can get a meeting done and dusted in an hour or half an hour. Do you know what I mean? We're not taking that child's needs, and I think we've lost all sense of why we're there, and we just soldier on because, and I'm sure everyone sitting here, your diary's got back-to-back meetings. Do you know what I mean? So everyone's really, struggling for time. So for us, it's efficient and effective, but for the child, absolutely not. And I do think we need to rethink that. And I think certainly during that time, we lost sense, I think, of what was important and who was important, and meeting those children's individual
Pretty
needs.
potent statement, if I may say so.
Sorry?
That's a pretty potent statement, if I may say so.
Thank you. But I think for me, it's for me that's really basic, really basic. But we lost all sense of what was important.
Maybe that's why it is important.
Yeah. Thank you.
One of the general trends that you talk about as a result of the pandemic and the people that you work with is that you say that generally there was a distinct period of time that you could identify that you were working with families and children. And I think you say from the statistics you see that to be around 10 months or so prior to the pandemic. At paragraph 87 you go on to say this is now far, far greater. I wondered why you think that is and why you're working with families much longer than you were previously.
Yeah. It's interesting, and I'll give you an example. I remember a staff who was recruited and started during the pandemic. So she started in October 2020, and her caseload, 60% of her caseload currently, and she works in our exploitation services, but 60% of her caseload is young people that she started working with in October 2020. Like, we're nearly 4 years on. And those young people were aged 12 at that time, so 15, 16 now. And the reason I think it's a lot longer is because we weren't actually able to do the work that we would ordinarily do in terms of that therapeutic work, and also talking about the harm that they had been exposed to, were being exposed to, because it was just about trying to build a relationship, and it was about dealing with that huge uncertainty, which was a pandemic, and that's what everybody focused on. Do you know what I mean? So we actually didn't get into the detail of why we were involved, and some of that was also because we didn't have a private space to be able to have that conversation. Sometimes it was about recognising that where they were living wasn't home, wasn't a safe environment, so we didn't want to be having those conversations and then placing that young person in a kind of unsafe environment again. Do you know what I mean? So a lot of that initial work for the first 2 years, it was about holding them. Some of that was about helping them with education, actually. So children who weren't going to school, so we were helping them with their reading and writing, which I know seems really basic, but actually we were trying to, support those young people. Some of it was about socialisation, because they weren't used to being around their peers. Some of it was about managing living at home with, and being around their brothers and sisters and their family members. So it wasn't the work that we would ordinarily do. Do you know what I mean? And then it takes a bit of time to break that pattern, because young people have got used to, you take them out for a coffee or take them for lunch, and it was like, what do you mean I've got to do something else? Do you know what I mean? So it's been much slower, and also during that period, young people's emotional well-being has deteriorated. So the work that we do is in smaller chunks. So before you would spend an hour, now you spend 20 minutes doing that piece of work, and then you build on it. So it's taken much longer to do that. The downside of that is we've been bombarded with lots of referrals, and referrals that we're not able to take. And obviously when we see the work that we are doing and who we're doing it with, and we see the referrals, that gives us, that puts extra pressure on us, because we're like, that actually those children that we're not supporting really need our support. But I'm also, and I work with an organisation where we deliberately don't have a waiting list. And that's very, very deliberate, because when you have a waiting list, there's a sense that something's going to happen. And there's a sense that we don't need to do something because something's going to happen soon. And the reason we don't have a waiting list is because I'm saying, I can't tell you if something's going to happen, when it's going to happen, so therefore you need to find something else for this child. Rather than thinking that actually I can stop worrying about this child because Barnardo's going to do something. Not quite sure when, but they're going to do something. And what we're clearly saying is, no, we're not going to do something. You need to go and find something else to do. But our staff, and like my team manager yesterday was talking about her worry. We were putting together an annual report, and she was talking about that worry in terms of the length of time it's taken us to pick up support for a family, because they've had to wait because we've not had capacity. And I'm like, that's not your worry, because actually up until the point we engage with that family, they're not our service users. Do you know what I mean? Somebody else needs to make those decisions, and it sounds really harsh, but actually somebody else needs to take responsibility for ensuring, because we don't have a statutory responsibility for those families. Somebody else does, and they've got resources that we don't have, so it's their responsibility, and we need to be really clear on that.
I'm afraid you've got less than 10 minutes, Ms. Traynor.
I'm grateful, Lord. I think you go on to say, paragraph 101, that at the point now, you're busier than ever and you're effectively at capacity. And I wondered if that you attributed any of that to the pandemic.
Oh, definitely. But without a doubt, I mean, I think what we've got is workers in the local authority who are now working with families, now working with children and young people whose needs have gone through the roof. And that's because there weren't other people who were sitting eyes and ears. There's no eyes and ears in those children. The harms that they have been exposed to were exposed to pre-pandemic, during the pandemic. We are now seeing that there's children who should have been on the Child Protection Register and actually who are now being accommodated because their needs are so great. But we are now seeing families where we weren't able to intervene earlier. So we've got so many more referrals. We've also got like yesterday we had a meeting with police and social work where their demands from both are like, but we need you to see these children. We've got these children who are going missing, and we need someone to do those return discussions. We've got local authorities saying we've got children who are being exploited here and now. We need that support. And we're saying actually, this is the funding you give us. This is, and they're like that, but there's no throughput in terms of the service and everything like that. But actually, we can't just close cases because we've got these other referrals coming in. Because otherwise we are doing more harm than good in terms of those young people that we're currently supporting. So yeah, our referrals have gone through the roof. Our funding has reduced in real terms. It's taken, for all the reasons I've said, in terms of not having staff who've got the same experience. We're having to do a lot more hand-holding in terms of supporting staff with some very difficult issues that children are presenting with, and that navigating that multi-agency system network has been quite challenging as well. But yeah, it's really it's hard because, like I said, we are working with children and families a lot longer than we used to, for all the reasons I've said.
In terms of rounding off your statement, one of the more general things you say at paragraph 113 is that one of the lessons that you hope can be learned is that we recognise, of course, the risk of COVID and the risk that the pandemic had, but that shouldn't override everything else, and particularly that shouldn't override potential harms to children. I wonder if all of the issues that you've spoken about, perhaps being left, you feel have really caused perhaps a longer term harm.
Sorry, say that again.
So you speak about, at the time, we didn't deal with the harms to children, and that perhaps the pandemic was more important than that. I wondered if you feel that that's had a long-term effect on children.
Oh, definitely, because actually I think we probably aren't very good at having conversations with children about what their experiences were like during that period. So I think what you've got is a whole raft of workers who are dealing with the here and now. And it's all about what children are doing or not doing. So I'll give you an example, a very basic example, where you've got we see lots of headlines about how schools are at breaking point, the levels of violence in school, for instance, children's behaviour in school. It's all about what children are doing. But what we're not thinking about is actually we had a whole group of young people who weren't supported through transitions in terms of primary, secondary adulthood. We had children who were exposed to harm during that pandemic, who didn't have a protective structure around them, and the home environment wasn't protective. We don't understand that sometimes children need to act out, and by acting out, that's their way of telling us that they are distressed, that they are traumatised, and that's particularly relevant for boys. So we see that acting out behaviour as a problem, and we see children as being aggressive and violent rather than seeing children trying to tell us something. Pre-pandemic, I remember lots of boys that I've worked with over the years who have said to me, my way of telling you something's wrong is by getting into a fight. My way of telling you I'm upset and distressed is by getting into a fight, and that's my way of self-harming. We need to understand that behaviour is about children trying to tell us something. No, it's not poor behaviour. It's not, and what we've got is saying our schools can't cope. You know, we need to exclude these children. We need to understand where's this behaviour coming from. Do you know what I mean? And that's about the harms children have been exposed to and continue to be exposed to, and that's not what we're talking to them about.
Those, I think, are all the questions that I had for you. We're now quite close to running out of time, but I wondered if there was anything else that we haven't covered that you thought it was important to raise today. Okay, so just two very quick things. So one, for me, I know, and obviously none of us had ever experienced this before, but I think if ever we have something like this again, I think we really need to consciously think about it. Is staying at home the best thing? Because for some children, staying at home was very damaging because home was not a safe place, right? We can't assume that a home environment is safe. And the second thing for me is we had a whole group of workers who were out there, like my staff were out there working, and we had a whole group of staff who were at home. And one of the challenges for workers today is that actually some of that group of staff who were at home have been churning out guidance, policies, legislation, right? And we've got a workforce who's overwhelmed with the promise, UNCRC, all the raft, and whilst we all embrace all of that, a lot of workers are just like that. I'm overwhelmed, I don't understand it, I don't know what's going on. So I think we need to strike a balance where we support people to do their job, which is fundamentally keeping a child at the heart, at the centre, making sure that child's voice is included. And next time, let's include children's voices and ask children and young people about what they think we should be doing, rather than this is what we need to do and this is how we need to do it. So that's me. Hopefully Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very helpful evidence.
Okay, thank you.
Good. 11:15. Good morning.
Good morning.
Right, Ms. Traynor, when you're ready.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning. I wonder if you could start by saying your full name.
Yeah, it's Crossan, Crossan, Guruge.
And you are a Children's Services Manager at Barnardo, Scotland, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And I think you tell us that you cover the Highlands and Islands region particularly.
Yeah, Highlands.
Highlands. I presume from that there are other children's service managers for lots of other regions in Scotland.
Yeah, a few of us around.
You have provided a statement to the inquiry that should be appearing on screen, and for our benefit, the reference for that is SCI WT 031450 and then number 1. That is information which the inquiry will have and will be able to use as evidence to consider. Your statement tells us, I think, that you've been in your current role since summer of 2021, is that right?
Yeah, that's about right, yeah.
And in paragraph 7, I think you cover some of the services which you now have responsibility for. I wonder if you're able to just briefly take us through those.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm just got kind of local responsibility for a residential children's home, a through care aftercare service, our Rise Highland service, our new kind of anchor service, which is detached youth work, and we've also got a partnership service supporting unaccompanied asylum seekers.
That's a role which you started in 2021.
Yes.
Prior to that, you tell us, I think, that when the pandemic started in March of 2020, you were the registered manager of one of those discrete services, which is Northern Lights, the residential children's home.
Yeah.
And when you were in that role in Northern Lights, working in the residential service, what were your responsibilities?
So I was the team manager at the time, registered manager for the service, so it was really everything to do with running the home. Effectively, I was based within the residential home at the time. I had previously been in the home as a senior practitioner and as a project worker, so I was very familiar with the home, but generally I reported to the assistant director at the time, and it was anything that would equate to running the home and engaging with the commissioners.
In terms of Northern Lights as a service, are you able to tell us, give us a general overview as to what it is, who lives there, and why they're there?
So it's a children's home for 5 young people. We take our referrals directly from the local authority, and we work very closely with them. So we look after them. We tend to look after its long-term placement, so they tend to come to us with the view of staying for a long time, may that be a few years until they're ready, and then we would support them once they move on from Northern Lights. Tends to be in the community in their own homes. So it's a very kind of safe, secure home for them.
You say there's 5 young people, or place for 5 young people within the home. How many staff work there?
So we've got 10 core staff, and in addition to that, we have, at the moment, we have a registered team manager and a senior practitioner.
You mentioned, I think, that the funding for that service comes entirely from Highland Council, is that right?
Yes.
And in terms of the people that live within Northern Lights, is there a particular profile that you can maybe describe?
No, I wouldn't say there was a particular profile. It tends to be just it's young people who can't stay at home. Tends to be some 14 upwards that we've accommodated. More recently, that's what we have.
And are there kind of typical examples of reasons why they're not able to stay at home?
It could vary, so it depends on what their individual plan they need, but it could be that they couldn't stay at home for parental breakdowns. Some of our young people don't have parents and have been accommodated because the local authority have got parental rights and responsibilities for them. It just depends on the individual needs. We do have a matching process, so we try and match our young people. Because it's long-term placements, where there's a process before we would take a young person into the home, to make sure that it's right for them first and foremost, but also that it be right for the other young people as well.
And when you say it's a long-term placement, what kind of timescale are we talking about?
So it would vary for every young person, but we would aim to keep them up until they wanted to move on. So 18 plus, we've had young people who've stayed until they're 21 and opted for continued care, but that option is always open to our young people. I think the benefit from our service is that because we have the through care aftercare service that works across Highland, when they come to our Northern Lights service, they're supported up until they're 26 through Barnardo's. So it's that kind of wraparound support.
At the time of the lockdown in 2020, you were working within Northern Lights.
That's right.
And in your statement, you tell us, I think, starting from paragraph 19, about the working patterns and routines that existed before that period.
Yeah.
And I think, I take it from what you're saying, that as soon as the lockdown happened, that all required some quite radical change.
Yeah, absolutely radical.
Can you tell us what happened and the course that it then followed?
Yeah. So before lockdown happened, the staff kind of worked on a rota. It tended to be 12-hour shifts. We've kind of changed that in the duration of the time we've had it to meet the needs of the service and to meet the staff. We always are constantly reviewing that. When there was, just before lockdown actually, when there was discussions about kind of socially distancing and potential lockdowns happening, quite a lot of our young people were kind of struggling with that and not really understanding it. We also didn't understand it. We'd never experienced anything like that before. And we looked at what might happen, and we decided as a team, actually, it was a group of us who were having discussions about this. And I suppose back then, none of us knew what this was. None of us knew what was going to happen. And we decided that if there was a lockdown, that the safest option for our young people and for us to protect the workforce, but to protect the young people as well and give them that stability, that we felt that we should lock down with them as families were. And obviously that's quite a radical thing to do. So we had actually initially discussed that as a team. A few of us, our colleagues, we talked, there was only 3 of us at the time. And before we even discussed it with Barnardo's or the local authority, we agreed that we wanted to put this option on the table. And we spoke to our families first to check that they would be okay with it. Our families all were supportive of it, and then we took it to kind of Barnardo's and discussed it, and then we took it to the young people to discuss with them to check that they were happy with it. And what we did was there was a team of 6 of us, and we did a week each basically. So we moved into the house on the Wednesday. Before we moved in, we were testing, and we were obviously following guidance. And we moved in on the Wednesday and then moved out on the following Wednesday, and then alternated teams.
So would you have a week on and a week off?
A week on, yeah. So we literally packed a suitcase for a week and moved in, and then before we moved out, we did our PCR testing and things and moved out, and then went back for a week.
That, I can imagine, and I think you talk about it in paragraph 21 of your statement, that obviously there was space for all of the residents to stay there. You had to make space for you to stay there.
So we were very lucky because the home that we have is a beautiful home. It's on the outskirts of Inverness, and it's on its own. It's got a lot of grounds in it, and it's a big house. So we had already had space for 2 sleepover rooms, which is part of the house anyway. But we moved, so the downstairs office, which was my office at the time, we just moved it around a little bit and put a kind of sofa bed in it, and we used that. So we did have the space, but we were very lucky to have the space because of the building that we have.
When you're talking about this week on, week off pattern, at the time I would imagine you didn't know how long it was going to go on for.
No, we didn't know.
How long did it go on for?
So that pattern went on for about 4.5 months, I think, from memory, and then we phased it out a little bit, so we didn't drastically go back to our old pattern. What we found was that the staff actually really liked that pattern, and the young people responded really well to that pattern, but it wasn't really sustainable. So we phased out and we cut our days down and sort of went to sort of 4, I think, first, then cut down to 3 and just phased out. So we did do long time, and we still do actually. So the staff still do kind of double shifts, and they'll sleep over for sort of 2 nights and are there for 3 days, and that works really well.
I think you say at paragraph 28, there's the first period of lockdown, and then there was a second period of lockdown, and you recognise that there were some benefits to the previous arrangement, but it needed tweaked.
Yeah.
And is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so we cut it down, and that was just because it was a lot to expect. We were also phasing other staff back in and trying to manage that kind of week on. We had too many staff to do that with as well. So.
You describe, I think, there being a lot of willingness from staff to take part in this, and you wouldn't have been able to do it if there wasn't that. I hope you don't mind me asking, but you do mention your own personal circumstances in the statement, and you say, I think, that at home you had a very young child who you had to leave for a long period of time. Yeah. How was that for you?
So at the time, it was, I think at the time, you know, when I reflect back, I often wonder if I knew what I knew now would have happened. But at the time, I was living with my husband and my daughter and my grandmother, who was older, and we really didn't know what this virus was, so we didn't have a lot of information. And there was, my husband at the time was furloughed, so he was off. He works in the construction industry, so him going to work wasn't happening. And I guess I was really worried about, I was trying to put my job and my family and trying to work out how I do that. And for me, managing a children's home, you can't do that from a distance. You need to be in there with the staff, especially during something that is very unknown and quite scary for people. So you almost need to roll up your sleeves and do that with them. But I was also very aware that every time I was going into work, I could potentially bring back something to my family or on what that impact would be. So that was part of the discussions when me and my colleagues were discussing, you know, what do we do with this and what's our action plan. I had that discussion with my husband, and we agreed that actually it would be safer to do that. And then we obviously had the discussion with Barnardo's and the local authority. It was really difficult. I remember at the time I thought, you know, it's okay, I'll keep in touch and, you know, FaceTime and things like that. But that was really hard for my daughter, so we had to stop that, and I would just have to sort of get video from my husband sent to me. I'd speak to my husband regularly, but I wasn't able to actually speak to her because when she saw me, she would be upset. And obviously the return home was quite difficult. I think it was the right thing to do for our young people as well. I remember at the time, you know, a lot of young people, when you're, you know, working in residential care, you are trying to create a safe space. You're trying to show young people that you care for them and that you're there for them, and almost that family environment. And a lot of young people in the past had, you know, had almost said, well, you know, you're kind of paid to work here. This is why you're here. You don't care about us and things. And I remember quite clearly the young people saying, like, you must care about us because you're doing this. So for them, it was a very physical response that you do care about us because you wouldn't do this if you didn't. And I think that was quite evident from how the lockdown went. So it was hard and it wasn't easy, but I do think it was the right thing to do.
At paragraph 25 of your statement, you say, when I look back, I recognise that we might have been a bit mad to suggest the lockdown plan, and it was a really big ask from staff. Yeah. So we had the discussion. There was 3 of us that had the discussion, and we just put it out there on the table, and there was no pressure for anyone to do it. You know, it was, you know, this is an idea. What do people think? And actually, there was 6 of us that kind of opted in and thought, no, we want to do this for own different reasons. I guess I was a bit conscious about what, you know, that maybe like Barnardo's thought about at the time, but they were so supportive of it and made sure that we were supported to do it. So we made sure there was enough of us that we could all get breaks, and that you know, we had contingency plans and things like that in place that people could come in and swap out and stuff. But the organisation very much supported us, and it was up to us, you know, if we wanted to stop that, we could at any point. So there's no need to answer this if you don't know, just let me know, but do you know if that is a model which happened in other residential settings?
From my knowledge, I think there was other services that did do a similar have a similar approach. I don't think they did the long approach, but I think that they, from what I know, is they did a couple of days each. I don't recall anyone doing a week at a time.
You'd go on to discuss within your statement about the guidance in place about those residential care settings. Yeah. And at paragraph 15 you say, I do not believe the guidance provided by the Scottish Government was specific enough. I believe that it focused more on care homes for adults rather than care homes for children, and there wasn't enough guidance for care homes for children. I wondered if you could maybe explain a bit further why you think it should have been tailored to the settings that you were working in.
Yeah, so I think it was, it's really difficult when you know, categorise care home because they are very different. And actually, every children's home is very different. They're managed differently. There'll be, the same sort of scrutiny, and they'll work with a care inspector and guidance, but they do operate differently. So I think that from when we were looking at the guidance, that we had to follow the guidance from the Scottish Government, but we had to also follow our Barnardo's guidance, and they aligned, but it was trying to manage it all, and actually it was actually easier for us to go into lockdown as a family than it was to try and manage all that guidance, because we just locked down. And I think for other services it would have been really difficult, because you had a staff team who were also trying to manage what was going on and then come into work. So I think it didn't capture enough for looked after children.
You then go on to say at paragraph 16 that you thought some of the guidance was quite unrealistic.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could explain that further. So
I recall there being guidance about, having areas within the house that were red zones and green zones and things like that, and walkways and stuff. And when you think about children's homes, what we are trying to do is their homes. So this is the children's home. So if I was going into my home and putting that guidance in for my child, teenagers are not going to abide by that. This is my home. Why would I have a red zone and a green zone and one-way systems around the house? So it was just things like that then that we're trying really, really hard to make these as homes for children and not institutions. So having a lot of this felt like an institution for young people, and we were lucky that we followed the guidance, but because we were locking down with the young people, we lived as a family, so we didn't have to have one-way systems in place.
You also say at paragraph 31 that another difficulty that you faced was that guidance was just constantly changing.
Yeah.
And that meant that people were really getting burnt out by how much work they had to do in order to keep up with those changes. Can you think of any examples of that, or tell us more about it?
I can't think of any examples, but just trying to navigate it all at the time. Well, for us, our priority was keeping our young people safe. That was the priority, and making sure that they found what was coming out, because they were watching the news regularly, and they were seeing, and it was quite scary. It was quite scary for all of us, so we were trying to protect them as well. But then having to do that and spend time with your young people, and then having to constantly update your risk assessments, and which we have to do anyway, but it was changing so quickly. Trying to keep up was really difficult while you were trying to process everything that was going on.
And were you able to explain what was going on to the young people that you were living with? How did they find it?
So we were, but again, there was lots of questions, and we couldn't answer all those questions, so we were in it together, really. We were kind of learning it together. And I do remember one of our young people, before lockdown had happened, had said, why do I have to socially distance? You just come into work all the time, so it's not that bad. But the minute we locked down, that was, they got it. They're like, this is really serious. So it was, for them, it really helped, because they were like, this is actually really serious.
As part of the experiences that you had within the residential setting, I think you mentioned that some of the young people were on court orders, compulsory supervision orders, effectively were legally regulated that they were staying there. And that, I think, as a consequence, has that they have to have children's hearings.
Yeah.
You discuss children's hearings within your statement at paragraph 44, and you say the interaction with the children's hearing system during COVID was just not great, I would say. Tell us more about that.
So we didn't have that many hearings that took place, but the ones that we did, they were online. So again, it's that young person's safe space. So if hearings are particularly difficult for young people, they're happening in their safe space, which is their home. And that wasn't easy for them, and then they had nowhere to go from there. So in my experience, where hearings have happened face to face, not all young people like that and don't always like to attend, but they can go back to a safe space. So, and the workers that are there with them will be able to support them with that, and almost help them manage what's going on. But when they were happening in their home, that was really difficult for young people, because where did they go when they wanted to to have space.
I think you also say young people should have been given a choice, but the choice was taken away from them. They weren't given one.
At the beginning, I think I recall that it just all hearings were done virtually, and then it kind of phased out. But at the time, they were all virtually, from my experience.
You also mentioned that practice, the practice of them being online, continued even after lockdowns had ended and some meetings were able to get back to face-to-face. Some children's hearings didn't do that.
Yeah.
And how did that have an impact?
So there was a few hearings that definitely could have probably been face-to-face. I think there were still restrictions in place, but the world was kind of opening up again. And I think that happened, I think there was only one that we were part of that happened virtually, and it didn't go well. And again, it's because the young people should be given a choice if it's virtual or face-to-face. And like I say, they might not want to do it face-to-face, but if they've got the choice, then they're making that choice and they're empowered to do that.
What are some of the reasons you think they might opt for a face-to-face children's hearing?
For young people?
Yes.
I think it depends on the young person, but I think it's a process for them. So it's like I'm going to somewhere rather than I'm having to join on a computer screen. The other example might be that because the people that are joining the hearing, maybe their parents or family members, might not have access to online or might not understand how to use online. So the young people may feel if it's face-to-face, then they'll come. Whereas if it's online, they might not come, or they might not, and they might find accessing it really difficult.
So people who are important to them might be missing.
Yeah, absolutely.
You go on to discuss generally the impact on young people and that you experienced within the service, and you say at paragraph 49 that initially the young people just didn't understand what was going on. Do you have any particular view on whether messaging and guidance was or should have been geared towards young people?
Yeah, I think we probably could have done a bit more with that. We all had the information that was coming out. I mean, the news was constant, were notifications and things, but I think at the time, it was so unknown for everybody that people were just scared as well. So if we knew what we knew now, we would be able to adapt that and make it really young person friendly. I don't think we did it that as good as we could have.
And how do you think it could be adapted?
So even using sort of social media and things like that, and sending them messages that it would be hard to say exactly what it could have been done, because back then we didn't actually know what this looked like. So the response was to safeguard everyone, which is the right response, but the information coming out was just changing so rapidly that it was hard to reassure young people that this was going to be okay when we actually didn't know if it was going to be okay.
I wondered if you thought that there is a difference between just generally young people who are getting messages and reading the media about the pandemic, and the young people who are being looked after by the local authority, whether it's in your residential care settings or whether it's in foster care or something like that. Do those two groups of people have different needs, and what are they?
Well, I think young people that are in residential care, there'll be a number of reasons why they're in care. So they've suffered trauma, so they might be more scared, they might not understand what's going on, they don't have the safety net of a family around them. That would be difficult for them when something really scary is happening in the world, that they don't have the security of their family around them.
You go on to discuss families and the birth families that were around the children who were residing within Northern Lights. And you say at paragraph 56 that you had mixed communications regarding contact, and you remember that being a very particularly difficult issue at the time.
Yeah.
You go on to say, firstly, some children had a generic letter which essentially said no contact should take place.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about that happening, and who did the letter come from?
I can't recall I can't recall it coming directly to me, but I recall there being discussions around it, and there was a lot of it felt at the time that young people that were in care, it was like just shut off that they just have to either stay in care or go back to their families. And then obviously contact would generally take place, depending on the young person's needs and what the arrangements are with the family. It varies for every child. That they may have contact in their home, so they may live in a residential care home but might spend a lot of their time with their family and their home family and then return to the residential home, but that obviously couldn't take place. So that, for some children, that would mean that there might be other children in the family, like siblings living at home, but they lived in a children's home. That just stopped because they couldn't go into another household, which was really difficult. And at the time, again, we were very lucky because of where our house is. So where we lived, we've got a lot of land around the house. So we were very lucky, again, that we had good weather, that we were able to put a number of gazebos up and distance them from the house, where we could have family visit in the gardens and have kind of socially distanced contact. It wasn't the same as going to your family home and spending time as a family, but that was a solution that we did have that maybe others didn't. We could create spaces within the grounds.
When you say that the children couldn't or weren't allowed to go to the homes of their birth families for the contact that they perhaps typically had, who told them that they couldn't, and where did that come from? Do you know? So
following the guidance, entering different households. So if we were one household in one bubble, so they couldn't go into another household or another bubble.
And were you told that by either you took that from the guidance, or was it from the local authority, or was it you as an organisation yourself decided that?
No, it was from the guidance. We were all following the guidance. So the local authority at the time were following the guidance. We were all managing the situation safely. When things did relax a bit better, and the households became more, we were able to opt into that. But at the beginning, contact with going into other homes we couldn't do.
And is it your understanding that social workers in the local authority prevented contact from happening as well between birth families and...
I don't think they prevented it. I think they were trying to do everything they could to keep it happening, but safely.
Can I ask a question? And this is a rather technical question. Ms. Trainer will keep me right if I get this wrong as a master of law, but paragraph 56, first two sentences, we had mixed communications regarding contact, and I remember it being really difficult at the time. Initially, I remember some young people had received a generic letter stating there would be no contact, which was really hard.
Yeah.
Now, I was reading that as that letter came from the social work department.
Yeah, I think it did come from the social work department at the beginning. I'm not sure, I can't recall the letter itself. I just remember there was a clear that they couldn't have contact at that time.
Yeah. And you say there, some young people, and I had read that or interpreted it as meaning that would be young people who are looked after children who there was a responsibility resting with the social work department, local authority. But I think you also said earlier in your evidence that not all children that resided with you fell into that category. Mm-hmm. So they might have been the ones that didn't receive that letter. Would that
that'd be correct, yeah.
I think that I understand that.
Thank
you.
You also mentioned there being a communication and a discussion at the time about whether children living in residential accommodation could just go home to their birth families and live there during the lockdown period. And you say, I'm sure that this was asked by social work. To me, this was a crazy idea.
So there was young people, and that would be very individualised as well. So especially where young people may have a lot of contact with their family, so which is quite positive. But still reside within a care home. And this wasn't specific to our service as well. There was discussions, and this was about people trying to plan, what can we do, what should we do, how do we do it safely. So young people who maybe specifically did spend periods of time on home contact, as they would say it, weekends maybe, there was a discussion around, could they go home and stay at home? Personally, I didn't think that was the right call. I think if it was possible to do that, we should be taking young people home full time, and that is my experience, is that where young people should live at home, they should always live at home. So that again was a bit confusing. I'm not clear whether young people specifically were asked that or if it was a generic discussion between professionals, but I think where we can keep young people at home, we should always have them at home.
You presumably became aware of that because that was something which Barnardos were involved in discussing with Highland Council.
No, it was just general across residential care, so it wasn't specifically around Barnardo's, and it didn't actually impact our young people within our home.
You obviously say to me this was a crazy idea, and you say that you didn't agree with it.
Yeah.
Why do you say that?
Because if young people can be at home full time, they should always be at home full time. I think that where young people can have, and this is again my opinion, where there's young people that may need respite, that's different. But if you can live with your family home, you should always be at home with family, with support if needed.
You go on to talk about how this parental contact, but also the general situation, has impacted on young people's mental health. And you describe your organisation particularly, or your close work with CAMS.
Yep.
You say at paragraph 65 that in general terms you understand the risk to children and young people's mental health to have increased due to COVID. What makes you say that, and can you tell us maybe a little bit more about what you saw?
I think I can probably only speak from the experience I had with the young people we worked with, but in terms of isolation and not having that, young people that were in school and that just going, or young people that were going to college, their experiences, that just went for them. So everything was online. That was really difficult. Peers, a lot of teenagers rely heavily on their peer relationships, which is really positive for them in terms of their growth. That went. They were communicating just digitally, which isn't the same as going and seeing your friend and having time with your friend. So in terms of their mental health, I think that was really difficult, and I think that would apply to all children and young people, not just children and young people that are care experienced.
You give a particular example at paragraph 66. You say we had a young person who did struggle with their mental health and had on a number of occasions needed to go to A&E. And what was difficult for you is that you couldn't go in with them and support them in a normal way.
Yeah.
Is there perhaps a distinction in those circumstances between somebody who's actually a parent in a parent role and can go in with them perhaps, and you as a worker who maybe isn't allowed?
I'm not sure. The young person was over 16 at the time, so that could have been a factor, but it did make it difficult. You would kind of go in the front doors and you would have to kind of leave just because of the restrictions, and it's hospitals. I don't know what it would have looked like for children with their parents, and if they were younger as well, but for us, that young person was over 16, so.
Did you see any other impacts or examples of mental health or health generally being a difficulty for the children that you were caring for?
Attending appointments with GPs was difficult as well, not specifically in relation to the residential home, but young people that need some support to go to GP appointments. That was difficult as well, because we couldn't go into GP appointments with them.
Did you ask?
Yeah, so I personally was supporting a young person after the lockdown and was unable to go in to an appointment and had to wait in the car. And that was particularly difficult because of how the young person was feeling. And then when they returned to the car and I asked how did it go, they said, I don't even know. It didn't work. He just didn't know what had happened. So his words didn't come out and he didn't feel that he'd got anywhere. Whereas if I'd been there, that support would have been there for him, whether to sort of advocate for him or guide him or, just be present with him, whatever he needed.
You go on to talk about generally there being changes to the services as a result of the pandemic, and one of them you've already mentioned, I think, is that now there is a change to working hours because of the arrangement that you had in place. I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how that has had a longer term impact.
I think that's actually impacted really positively actually for our young people. So when we kind of decided to do the lockdown rota, as it was, a week on, when we were phasing out of that, we looked at how we best do that so that the young people had that consistency, and that we just managed to transition it. And then when we spoke to the wider team about what they felt, and when we do these things, we speak to the staff and we speak to the young people and we take everyone's voices into consideration. And then people were quite happy with the idea of doing more hours, but, not as many as a week, but, having a kind of block. The young people liked the week on. We had really a lot of positive feedback about that. So then we moved to the sort of 2 and 3 model, which was sort of 2 sleepovers and then about 3 days. And that does work really well. I think for the young people, it does give them that consistency. They have a kind of idea of who's on. There's less people coming in and out as well. So if you have people that are on back shifts and day shifts, you have more people coming in. So there's less people, you just have 3 people a day, and it's just consistency for the young people.
I suppose it might feel more like a home environment rather than a kind of work shift pattern.
Yeah, definitely.
And is that something that is in place now?
Yep, absolutely, yeah.
You, from 2021, I think you say that you were in charge of what's called the Springboard service.
Yeah, that's the aftercare service.
And I wondered if that service has seen any longer term impact.
I can't say from my experience the impact of COVID. I was involved with Springboard at the time, but I wasn't directly managing the service at the time. And the service is growing and developing naturally anyway, so I wouldn't be able to give an example of any impact on that service.
In general terms, you make comment within your statement, we've already discussed that the guidance wasn't young person friendly. And at paragraph 80, I think you conclude by saying specifically there should have been a more considerate response for different demographics of people. Mm-hmm. And one of those demographics is looked after children and young people. I wondered, do you feel as if that's a demographic that was perhaps forgotten about?
From my experience, yes. I think I recall the guidance being social care guidance, and there would have been a reference to looked after children, but I don't know that it was specific enough. Not from what I had saw anyway.
And what would have helped you? If you're able to say, it's difficult looking back now, I can appreciate that, but can you think of any examples of things that we could do differently?
I can't think of any examples, but I think at the time we were launching with the Promise. The Promise has been, really heavily in the news and things, and which is fantastic. So it would be a good time to think about the Promise in terms of lockdown and what that looked like for young people. I think we can't forget that it was a really difficult time for people, and people were just trying to do the safest thing possible. We were very lucky with our service because we had a really good support team around us. We had a good senior management team. We were supported to do what we needed to do for our young people, and we were able to respond to the needs of the young people. So I wouldn't be able, if I was to say I would go back and do something differently, I probably wouldn't do anything differently because I think what we did at the time was the right thing to do, and it worked really well. But we were also very lucky to do that, and that was because of the support that we had from the organisation, the support we had from the local authority, and also where we were located. That was a big part of our decision in terms of the layout of the house and what we had there. That wouldn't have been possible for all children's homes to do that because of the size of the building, for example. So I don't think there would be anything specific that I would go back and say we would do differently.
You mentioned there the Promise, and that perhaps we maybe should have thought a bit more about the principles to do with that. For those who don't know what the Promise is and what the ethos of that is, can you tell us a bit about it?
Yep, so the Promise is it's not new now, but it came from the Care Review, and it's about making Scotland the best place for children, regardless of whether you're care experienced or not, and making sure that the right scaffolding and support is there for young people and their families, and for the workforce.
And when you say we could have been a bit more mindful of that, what do you mean?
I think just that the Promise is a really good. There's a lot of work being done for the Promise, and it's a really good piece of guidance, I would say. And I think if we were thinking about it now, we would think differently in terms of what it looked like for families and the support that we're offering, and for the workforce as well. But we weren't there back then, and that was because we didn't know what this virus was. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what it looked like. Things that we were seeing in the news was really scary. So the thought of getting COVID was scary for people. what we saw was when people did get COVID, not some of them were okay with that, and that was easier. So I think back then we just didn't know what we were dealing with.
You mentioned there the workforce. You obviously were a manager and continue to be a manager in charge of a workforce, first of all in Northern Lights, but now more spread across a wider variety of services. Can you tell us about a kind of any general trends or difficulties that you might have experienced because of the pandemic period?
I think we were in this service that we had, we were quite specific on what we were doing. And obviously in terms of numbers, we were specific in how many numbers of staff we needed. What we did is we made sure that the staff that weren't able to do lockdown for whatever reason were supported as well, so we didn't just forget about them. So they took on different roles as well, so we had a lot of support that we were distributing on behalf of the Scottish Government from Barnardo's, that some of those staff members took part in doing that role, and it was different. There were more out there and food parcels and things like that, but we made sure that we all connected, so that was really important. And one of the things so we had obviously our kind of core support, and we had a lot of support in terms of wellbeing meetings and discussions and things like that, but we also made sure that we would have, again, similar to what other families did, is that we would have our kind of quiz nights as well, so all the team would join in, and the young people, when we were doing it from the residential home, and we would have the kind of big screen up, and we'd have quiz nights, and the young people would take part and things like that. So we did all that as well, and that was about making sure that the staff that weren't part of what we were doing still felt part of it as well. And obviously the young people could continue the relationships with the staff that weren't living with them at that time. So that was obviously really good too. But I think overall in terms of impact, it actually was a really good experience for our team. And we didn't actually have any negative impact from it.
And thinking about there being, I suppose, two separate workforces, one who's involved in the caring and is effectively living within the residential setting, and one who's not able to do that for whatever reason. After the pandemic, how has it been reintegrating those two groups of people?
Fine, yeah. It's been all, yeah. So when we've started to phase into the kind of different shift pattern, we phased other staff back and things. I don't think that it was a really difficult thing to do, because we kept the relationships there with the young people. So although they weren't living with them, we kept the communication. We used our digital platforms to do that. So we used Teams and Google Meet and things to connect up, facilitated by the staff, but and where other staff felt comfortable to do that. And then as things relaxed, where we were able to kind of have contact and meet, we would meet some of the staff. They would come out and we'd maybe go a walk and things like that. So it wasn't really difficult to integrate them back in. We've been very lucky because we've got a really good workforce. We managed to retain staff really well. So it was all about the young people and what they felt they needed at the time, and making sure that people were available, telephone calls and things too.
That is all of the matters which I wanted to raise with you, but I wondered if there's anything that we haven't covered that you thought it was important to raise today.
No, I don't think so.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much for your evidence.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Now, we're finished sharp. Normally I'll see if we can get the next witness in early. I suspect that's not going to be possible with the next witness who has some special needs. Yes. So I think it has to be 1:30. Sorry about that, but thank you.
Thank you.